if we're talking about the lack of creativity in the field of Kabbalah, and I think we could say that there is a lack of creativity in most areas within the Orthodox world, and that is because part of it is because the post-Holocaust feeling that the world as we know it has come to an end. The great scholars of the previous generations are no longer with us. The world of Torah has been destroyed, and then only thing that we could do is preserve the old tradition. This is something that I heard from my professor in Bar Ilan years ago, Jeffrey Wolfe. He argued that was the case with a book called Sefer Hasidim, which I hope to touch on when during that course, but we didn't have time. Sefer Hasidim comes from the circle of Hasidei Ashkenaz. Rabbi Yehuda Hasid, Rabbi Lazar of Worms, Rabbi Kolonimus, they were the early pious rabbis of Germany in the 12th century, in the 13th century, and their literature is very not just esoteric. There are those who believe that it was meant originally only for the family and only for the narrow circle that they had, and there are certain things there that are so far-fetched and really do not belong within the mindset of Jewish beliefs. Like I mentioned to you, they speak about demons and women who devour children and werewolves and the like. And in a very interesting twist, it has become an essential part of the Jewish library. Sefer Hasidim. Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, who's a man of halacha, was the late chief rabbi of Israel, quotes this book in his writings hundreds of times, and as a valid source of halacha. And you ask, how did this happen? So Jeffrey Wolfe, his theory was that the book was sanctified following the death, the Black Death in Europe, because that was a disaster that struck the Jewish community. And after the disaster, they look back and they said, what have we done to deserve that? And they come to the conclusion that they're really unworthy. And the only thing that they could do is learn the literature of the previous generation. So everything that survives from the previous generations now becomes sanctified. And in the same manner, after the Holocaust, there's sort of like people took stills of life in Europe before the Holocaust and decided this is how a Jew an observant Jew should live. So from here you have this ridiculous practice of wearing black hats. Right? Why would a young man in the 21st century wear a black hat? It's not fashionable anymore. And they will say it's not about fashion. We wear it to stand out, to show that we're not like them, or even to make sure that we don't sin. But this is not. It doesn't make sense. I mean, you see in some yeshivot when a child turns 13, bar mitzvah, he puts a hat. So you see this tiny kid, wearing like this big hat, and it doesn't fit him. And you feel bad for the child who has to do that. Where does it come from? It's really funny or ironic. This dress code only became a dress code in Europe in a couple of years between the two world wars. Prior to the World War I, and even in a long period between the wars, the students in the yeshivot were considered what is called in Yiddish nebech. They were like miserable people. They were frowned upon. There was in many yeshivot the students did not have. There was no economic foundation for the yeshiva, so they would just sleep at the dorm and go to study, but there was no food, so they had to go around town and ask the Jewish community to host them. It's called le'echol yamim, to eat days. meaning each day you were by another person. And only it was the one of the students of Rabbi Israel Salanter, who founded the Musar movement, who was very concerned with human dignity. His name was Rabbi Simcha Zissel Ziv of Kelm, and he spoke about human dignity. He said, "You cannot be a scholar of Torah when you don't have the basic dignity, when you don't look good and don't think of yourself as a respectable person." And as a result, he said, you have to dress properly. We have to raise enough money so you could eat in the yeshiva and not be a beggar, etc. But and then at a certain point, the black hat, but it was not black at the time. There was any color, but a hat was the mark of someone who was well dressed. And it was not even in all the yeshivot. There were two. It's split between the Slavotka and the Novhardok yeshivot. Slavotka insisted on appearance and to dress impeccably, where Novhardok said you should not care what people say, to the extent that students were sent to the pharmacy to buy a hammer. I mean, just crazy things, so people would mock them, so they will become immune to mockery. Meanwhile, in the other yeshiva, people start wearing those hats. And the surviving rabbis who came from this school of thought, after the Holocaust, sanctified that, and now everybody does that. So here I have given an example of music, which is a cultural thing. They have an example of the dress code. And in the same manner, Caroline, it happens also in the world of knowledge, whether it's halacha or Torah interpretation or Kabbalah. There's no creativity, no new things are introduced, but rather it's just a reworking and regurgitation of the old material. So, in order to change that, you really need to create a generation of scholars and also people who believe in their ability and their capacity to bring a change, and that it is needed. And so this is one element. The other element, as I said, is the total paralysis that took over European rabbis following the Enlightenment and the Emancipation. It did not affect Sephardic Jewry in the same manner. Menahem alone was a judge in Israel. He wrote the series called Jewish Law. You have it in the library, 3 very thick volumes. The history of Jewish law, very interesting. He also wrote a book called Women's Status, Ma'amad Aisha, in Judaism. And at the end, in the appendix, he speaks about the scholars of Morocco from the 17th century on. And he says that he was surprised to find out how creative they were in the field of halakha. And I can attest to that because I really work with the literature of Moroccan rabbis of that time. And you find amazing halachic sensitivity and an understanding of reality. For example, you have they were already in the 17th or 18th century. They were talking about changing the law of inheritance to allow a daughter to inherit her father alongside the man. They were talking about possibilities to have a prenuptial condition, so they could nullify the wedding retroactively and not create cases of agunot. They were willing to rely on different levels of kashrut when they traveled. They allowed the use of electricity on the holidays. There are so many. I can't even list them now. But the point is, there was creativity there because they did not see themselves as fighting against Moderna or against reform, but rather they were thinking of how do we make the Torah work for our community. Therefore, you had creativity. But unfortunately, in the last 50 years or 70 years, since the establishment of the State of Israel, the Sephardic Jews who came to Israel were overwhelmed by the Ashkenazi tradition, and there was also another event that people don't talk about that much. But what happened after the Holocaust was that the Ashkenazi yeshivot were depleted, and there was an effort to recruit students from North Africa. So delegates of the yeshivot went to Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, and they brought about 4,000 people and convinced them to come to the yeshivot of Gateshead and Lakewood, Gateshead in England, Lakewood in America, and Aix-les-Bains in France. But that was they basically took away all the many of the scholars and many of the potential leaders of the community, and trained them in the Lithuanian Orthodox mentality. So they completely brought to a stop this possibility of development. So there we have this problem there as well. And finally, one more element that added to that is the interaction within the state of Israel, which is the deadly concoction of religion and politics. So that where the religious leaders who got entangled in politics became tainted, and the non-religious people who saw how the religion is controlling and distorting life in Israel grew tired of it and alienated themselves. So you have this polarization in Israel. I think all these are factors that contribute to the lack of creativity, but that is changing in the last, I would say, 10 years. There's a growth of what is called, non-denominational yeshivot in Israel, different types of schools that not necessarily put a label. Some put a label to the extent of calling it the secular yeshiva, which I think is still for me is an oxymoron. I know the founder. I don't think it's secular, because the moment you engage with our classical text, you are touching the religion and the moral values of the Jewish people. But they mean that they don't accept the totality of the Orthodox world, which is fine. So that's a long answer to the question, what happened with the development of Kabbalah. But this is really something that, if we think of what do we do as rabbis, as teachers, and we apply our knowledge, this is an area where we should do that.
Yeah, I don't know if you're referring to this yeshiva, but Machon Pardes is similar, has that quality to it of inviting Jews across the board to come and study Torah,
right?
And with the conviction that that experience is going to be transformative, without prescribing or imposing any way that that transformation would be. And I feel very blessed to have had that encounter. And what I found frustrating is that when I came back to the States and tried to find a home, there isn't one. There really isn't correspondence.
Maybe in New York you have like Mechon Hadar, or but I don't think parallel to Pardes that they have it here. The AGR closest.
Exactly. And the other thing I wanted just to comment on is when you're talking about the difference between the rigidity of the Ashkenazi world as opposed to, after the Holocaust, as opposed to the Sephardic community, it having just finished the medieval Jewish history course, what you're describing, the retraction from creativity and the sanctification of the past, seems to me to be stemming from such fear and trauma. And not to say that there wasn't that in the Sephardic world, but certainly in Western and Eastern Europe during this time, the devastation was so profound that it seems to me psychologically understandable, at least, that world would have such a greater, more passionate response to the stay put. as opposed to the creativity that was, that you see in the Sephardic world.
Yes, and in the Sephardic world also, I think one of the difference really goes way back into the when you trace our history to the split between the Ashkenazi and Sephardic world, and I touched on this before. The Ashkenazi communities were formed in Germany from the 10th century on, in close contact with German Christian Catholicism. That was it was very antagonistic to Jewish existence. First, in terms of theology, without getting to the physical realm, the idea of the Holy Trinity for Jews was repugnant. The idea of that the divinity is divisible. I know it's ironic when you think of the Sefirot. That's where the scholar was so concerned about the Sefirot, but with the Sefirot, at least they try to keep the language of those are forces within the divine, and not say that there are three which are one. It was different, but the imagery, the statues everywhere were also a problem that for them immediately conveyed idolatry. Besides that, there was the living myth. There's an excellent book on Christian anti-Semitism that explains that what happens, the animosity between Jews and non-Jews in Europe, which, if you think of it, never really subsided from the moment Jews came into Europe in the 10th century to the 20th century, and even now, and he had not disappeared. And he says this is because of what he calls the living myth. The myth, if you recall, we said, is something that happened in the time before time, and then that later on our actions somehow reflect the myth or continue the myth. So, for example, the woman who lights Shabbat candles is now re-engaging in the act of fixing what Hava did. She's connected to Hava, but she has never had contact with Hava. She had contact with her mother who knew, but nobody knew Hava originally. Whereas the story in the New Testament, the Gospels of Jesus being betrayed and being killed or executed by the Jews, the Christians in Europe saw themselves as the direct grandchildren of those people who knew the murderers of God. So it's a living myth. It's like, oh, you're the guy. My grandfather knew your grandfather. So it was much harder to overcome this kind of bias and myth. And that brought to a process called the demonization of the Jews, where Jews were demonized. And until today, I heard from people who lived in the States that in places where there were not too many Jews, that in school their friends asked them, so where are your horns? Did you cut them off? That's in the 20th century. But that was on one hand the feeling of Jews in Germany, and added to that was that they looked, at least in the first 150 years, they stood out in their appearance. They had the Jewish look to them. We have actually a text from medieval Germany where the rabbi speaks about how the non-Jews mock them for having dark skin, dark eyes, and dark hair, and it was only after a long period of assimilation, but kosher assimilation, they would purchase, because the community was small, they would acquire slaves that usually came from Eastern Europe. That's where the Slavs were literally slaves, and after a period of 2 or 3 years working for them, they would convert and marry them, and that's when that element was a little bit removed, even though not completely. So you have all these elements that the Jews are so threatened by the outside community. Also, the prowess of that community, the power of that community. They are migrants. They are immigrants that are far removed from their land. It's a different language, different culture. so they have to be isolated. So the natural reaction was retraction and reclusion. We're going to close ourselves within our ghetto, whether physical or mental. Whereas Sephardic Jews, in most cases, who lived under the rule of Islam, even though Islam also had, its periods of clashes with Christianity and with Judaism, most famous are the Almohads and Almoravids of Spain, and who came from Morocco to Spain. And people know about the Omar Pact and the fact that Jews were called dhimmi, like second-class citizens. But not many people know that those rules were, in most cases, were not applied and were not forced. And Jews had actually very high positions in the Muslim world. But besides that, Jews were not afraid of the Muslim religion because it was not so different. The mosque was clean, it was empty. The music, the prayer, the language was a similar language. They lived in the same cultural continuum. The Muslims believed in one God, so they were monotheists, just like Jews. And they did not attempt, at least after the initial period of the rise of Islam and Muhammad, they did not attempt to convert Jews by force as Christians did in most cases. So Jews felt more comfortable in keeping the tradition of appropriating whatever could be taken from the foreign culture and making it their own. So in a sense, the Sephardic Jews went through the process of enlightenment and reform and emancipation almost 700 years before Ashkenazi Jews, because they went through it during the Golden Age in Spain, and they became immune to the detrimental impact of outside society by appropriating that which was good for them. So all these elements, those are things that are still they still dictate the way we think of our culture, of our identity, of Sephardi and Ashkenazi, Kabbalist and Halachist, and so on. It's worth it to learn it and to determine what is it that I think I could contribute to bring positive change to the Jewish world, to the world in general, and do something with it.